In Chapter 20, we are concerned primarily with microbial diseases of the nervous system and decided to make sort of an outline here. We're going to start with, again, bacterial diseases and cover many nonspecific causes of bacterial meningitis, then examine a sort of more specific disease, leprosy, which is caused by only one bacterium, namely a mycobacterium, and then also some types of diseases which are more appropriately termed intoxications because the effects result from the toxin produced by the respective bacteria rather than the invasiveness of the cells themselves. So we'll also look at some viral causes of meningitis and encephalitis, as well as the specific viral diseases polio and rabies. Now you may be wondering, if we're talking about the central nervous system, how is it that infections occur in this area, which is normally sterile? Of course, it has no normal microbiota. This is one of the areas of the body in which great lengths anatomically have been gone to in order to exclude microorganisms from the very sensitive and vulnerable nervous system. However, pathogens can gain access by a number of means, most common including trauma, such as breaks in the bones, medical procedures, including needles or surgery. Certain types of pathogens can actually travel along the peripheral nerves, so there may be a site of infection, say in the hands or feet, and then the agent can travel along the peripheral nerves to the central nervous system, wherein certain conditions, such as meningitis, occur where the pathogens infect and kill cells of the meninges and thereby gain access to the brain. Also, inflammation can alter the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Perhaps you learned about this, hopefully you did, in anatomy. This is a semi-permeable blood-brain type of a membrane barrier in which tight junctions of the blood vessels allow only diffusion of water and some nutrients and gases into the cerebral spinal fluid. And this picture on the right here shows, again, what normal, sterile appearing CSF would look like compared on the right here with obviously something is growing in this, and turbid CSF would certainly be a sign of infection. So the two general ways in which bacteria can cause disease of the nervous system include the actual infecting of cells, so neurons, and this occurs both in meningitis and viral and bacterial causes. Generally, those caused by bacteria are much more serious, as well as leprosy directly affects the nerve cells. And we mentioned intoxications where bacteria growing someplace else or ingestion of toxins cause the associated signs associated with these diseases, botulism and tetanus, and we'll see how these work. But we're going to start with meningitis. The meninges are the membranes surrounding the spinal cord and the brain. This is a cross-section of a portion of the cranium is given in your textbook. And the meninges you'll see here, again, these membranes surrounding the brain, and they contain the cerebral spinal fluid, okay, which sort of bathes these tissues and provides the oxygen and nutrients to the brain. So infection of the meninges will be accompanied in most cases by a sudden very high fever, a stiff neck, headache, and can be diagnosed in some cases by the increased numbers of the white blood cells in the cerebrospinal fluid. Infection of the brain itself is referred to as encephalitis, and not surprisingly, some pretty dramatic changes can result from bacterial infections of the brain and may be observed by behavioral changes, coma, and eventually even death. So let's start with some of the primary causes of bacterial meningitis. This is one of these kind of non-specific diseases where a number of pathogens individually or perhaps in combination might be involved. So these include the list that I've given here, and we'll start with the first one, Neisseria meningitidis, and keeping in mind too that opportunistic members of the normal flora can also sometimes be involved if they can gain access to the deeper tissues and then infect, and then somehow make their way into infecting the meninges. Neisseria meningitidis, we alluded to a while back. This is kind of notorious for blebbing the outer membrane, which releases lipid A into the body and triggers many of the adverse effects associated with endotoxins, including fever, inflammation, shock, and abnormal clotting or disseminated intravascular coagulation. So this is an illustration of Neisseria meningitidis, which typically grow as diplococci. You may wonder what this LOS means. The lipo-oligosaccharide is similar in composition to LPS, but because the side chains are shorter, they call it LOS, because the LIGO is kind of shorter than poly. These have, in addition to the LOS, fimbriae, which they use to attach to host cells, as well as a capsule, which, as you guessed it, helps them avoid phagocytosis. So Neisseria without these are avirulent. Of a capsule for virulence should hopefully remind you also of Streptococcus pneumonia, which we've mentioned a number of times in that same context. That is, the encapsulated strains only are able to cause disease as a result of those protecting them from ingestion and digestion by the phagocytes. So strep pneumoniae is as the name implies, a gram-positive coccus, but unlike other species of Streptococcus that grow on longer chains, these are sort of characterized by a characteristic paired growth pattern, which is referred to as diplococci. That's seen clearly, I think, in this micrograph down here. So people that, for example, get the flu and may die as a result, usually again aren't dying from the flu, but rather from pneumonia, and typically it's this organism that is responsible for that secondary infection. Speaking of pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza was mistakenly believed to be the causative agent of influenza before the viral etiology became evident, but these are obligate parasites, not intracellular. Generally, they are opportunistic and only cause disease under conditions of stress or other precipitating factors. These also have capsules, which help them persist and evade the immune system. And it's on the basis of the capsular proteins that these are subtyped. So you may have even heard of Hib, the Hib vaccine, and that's to provide protection against the influenza type B, so Hib, H-I-B. But again, in this context, a cause of meningitis, as well as being involved occasionally as in pneumonia, so sometimes even called bacterial influenza. So the last one that we want to consider at this point is the last two, Listeria monocytogenes and Streptococcus agalactiae. Listeria we have mentioned a few times, but primarily in the context of this being one of the psychrotrophs, which is able to grow under refrigerated conditions and survive within soft cheeses and other types of refrigerated dairy or lunch meats. The concern primarily being with ingestion of contaminated food and drink, by women who are pregnant, because this bacterium can cross the placenta and infect the fetus and then cause complications in the newborns. So Listeria monocytogenes, again, one of the complications of listeriosis is the meningitis. Strep agalactiae similarly can cause meningitis in newborns. In this case, the group B strep, remember how we talked about how those are typed? These are normally maybe a resident of the normal vaginal microbiota in some women, and the infants acquire those during the birth process. Again, notice the involvement of a capsule, which helps them avoid the immune system. Okay, so what are the primary causes currently of meningitis? If we look at aspects regarding epidemiology, we mentioned the Hib vaccine. This has been in use since the 1990s. So before, although it was a leading cause of bacterial meningitis, is relatively rare nowadays. But meningitis from Neisseria, that's the N, meningitis, and strep pneumonia are currently the most prevalent, although we do have vaccines available. But the meningococcal meningitis is the one that is sometimes associated with epidemics, especially in crowded conditions such as dorms and camps and army barracks and so on. So this is easily spread, this type of meningitis, between individuals living in very close proximity. We just mentioned Strep galactiae causing meningitis in newborns. In contrast to Listeria, this does not cross the placenta, but it instead is acquired during the birth process. And Listeria, besides being passed from the mother to the fetus, is not otherwise transmittable between people. Okay, I always like to tie lectures in with current events, although this, I guess, is not totally current from last fall. But every year there's at least one or more outbreaks of Neisseria meningitidis on college campuses, and this fall the one that I happened to stumble across was one that occurred at UMass Amherst. Again, just to show you the type of panic that meningococcal outbreaks can foster. Sorry, my kids just walked in. It's a good thing this is the last slide. Only 2 cases here, if you notice here, 2 cases which they determined to be the same strain, was deemed an actual outbreak, and they set up a vaccine clinic to get everybody protected and vaccinated, just because, again, meningitis, especially bacteria, can cause some very serious complications. That is it for today. I will see you in class tomorrow, and we'll pick up with the rest of Chapter 20.